This case took place in Chile in 1987 during the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. More than 180 poor families were violently displaced by the authorities from their community in the Iquique province and relocated to the Alto Hospicio sector in Chile. Alto Hospicio was a dusty, desolate piece of land in the middle of the desert, also in the Iquique province. In this settlement, there was no electricity, drinking water, or even a sewage system. There were no offices, schools, or hospitals, and the area lacked all urban infrastructure. Because there were no roads, garbage trucks couldn't reach the settlement either, resulting in massive piles of waste that were nearly impossible to clear. This worsened the already harsh living conditions of the people. Over 30 years later, the city still stands in the desert, with over 120,000 people now living there. The area is still developing, with small businesses, several schools, a hospital, and a police station now in place, but the standard of living remains very low. A study on urban conditions and infrastructure conducted in 2014 ranked the city last in the nation for quality of life. Unbearable heat during the day, equally unbearable cold at night, poverty, rising unemployment, and homes made of low-quality, flimsy materials create extremely harsh conditions for normal life. As a result, many residents dream of leaving Alta, but without enough savings, it's difficult to move away. Most people struggle daily for survival in extreme poverty. Several times a week, utility companies deliver clean drinking water, which is urgently needed in the poorest parts of the city. Women from these neighborhoods leave their homes early in the morning with containers to stand in long lines to collect water, while the men spend their days working in the mines or collecting garbage for a pittance. In other words, life in Alta is very difficult. At the beginning of 2001, a series of mysterious disappearances in the city attracted national media attention. Some government officials faced public outrage and concern. The tragic events surrounding the disappearance of the victims left a devastating and shameful mark on the history of the Chilean police. The indifference and disdain with which the authorities and law enforcement treated the victims' families reflected the class consciousness characteristic of certain parts of society at the time. It all began in mid-September 1998, when some regional newspapers reported that police had found the body of a girl on a beach in the Alta area. The victim was 17-year-old Graciela Saravia. The police had been alerted by fishermen who were out with their boats a few dozen meters from the shore. The men claimed to have seen a parked white car and a couple arguing, but they were too far away to see the faces of those involved and decided not to intervene, thinking the situation wouldn't escalate into murder. In fact, the young girl had been struck multiple times in the face with a rock, killing her instantly. Her body and legs bore multiple bruises, indicating that the attacker had dragged her along the ground before and after the murder. While the country was preparing for national holidays, this mysterious crime was quickly overshadowed and covered up, with no suspects found. On November 24, 1999, a year after Graciela's murder, a 14-year-old girl named Macarena Sanchez mysteriously disappeared. She left home early in the morning to go to school, but never arrived. The police's reaction to her parents' appeal was highly unusual. They suggested that many young girls in Iquique offer intimate services for money, and that Macarena might have run away from home to support herself in this way. Authorities advised the parents to wait a few days, assuming their daughter would eventually return home. However, as the days, weeks, and months passed, hope of finding the girl alive faded. The authorities didn't bother to conduct a serious investigation, wrongfully assuming that she had voluntarily left home. On February 21, 2000, another girl named Sarah Gomez was reported missing. A month later, on March 23rd, 14-year-old Laura Sola disappeared on her way to school and never returned home. On April 5th of the same year, Catherine Arsa was reported missing after she failed to return home. Gradually, teenage girls began to vanish without a trace. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and the police's only response was that they had all left home in search of a better life. The authorities' tactlessness and inaction were staggering, forcing the parents of the missing girls to take to the streets in search of answers. Due to a lack of well-paying jobs or simply because of family issues, many young people left home in search of financial opportunities, and some found illegal means as the quickest way out of poverty. This was, at least, the reasoning of local authorities. Rumors circulated that some of the girls who had left home had been transported to Bolivia and enslaved, but this remained speculation. On May 22nd, another girl, 17-year-old Patricia Palmer, disappeared on her way home from school. She became the sixth victim in a series of recent disappearances. 11 days later, Macarena Montesinos Viviana Guerre, the eighth victim, disappeared. However, her father was not left in the dark. Some months earlier, Orlando Guerre, Viviana's father, had read a flyer seeking information about another missing child, Catherine Arsa. A few days before Viviana's disappearance, she had shown him the same flyer and posted it on a lamppost near their home. Guerre found out that Viviana and Catherine had attended the same school and that 6 other girls had disappeared under similar circumstances. He then decided to organize the relatives of the missing girls to pressure the authorities for a proper investigation. Orlando's rebellious spirit helped him and the other parents overcome their despair. The possibility that a whole network of kidnappers and traffickers was at work in the city deeply worried the locals. The authorities did their best to calm the public. Under Orlando's leadership, volunteers formed small search teams and began combing the area for clues. They visited nearby villages, distributed flyers with photos of the missing, and expanded their search after using up their last savings. Unfortunately, all their efforts were in vain. Weeks later, during another search in remote areas, the first clues were found. On June 18, 2000, a school uniform and a backpack were discovered at a garbage dump relatively close to the city. These items belonged to Viviana Guerre. A few hours later, personal belongings of Catherine Arsa were found at another dump. Some of the recovered clothes were stained with blood. In the following months, the actions of the missing girls' parents garnered widespread media attention. One of the most chilling and heartbreaking images was when the grandmother of one of the missing girls found her granddaughter's underwear at a garbage dump. Her cries of disbelief reflected the pain of all the parents who had yet to find their daughters. With the belongings of the girls in hand, the relatives organized small marches, which gradually drew media attention to their plight. For the first time, the case and its strange circumstances became public. All the girls had disappeared either on their way to or from school. The parents were unanimous in their belief that their daughters had not run away from home and that something terrible had happened to them. They were all conscientious students from modest but respectable families with strong values. In other words, these disappearances deserved serious attention and a proper investigation by the authorities. Over time, public pressure grew, and the demonstrations organized by the relatives of the missing girls attracted more supporters and concerned citizens. Orlando Guerre continued to pressure the authorities and even secured an audience with then Chilean President Ricardo Lagos, who was on a business trip to Iquique. The president agreed to give the desperate parents some of his time, but remained cold and unsympathetic. He assured them that the police were doing their best to find the girls, but for now, they needed to be patient. With that, the president ended the meeting and left, unwilling to listen to the parents' accusations against the police. Later, Lagos told reporters that he believed the investigation was the most thorough the country had ever seen. He also assured them that he was willing to meet with the parents of the missing girls again if they had any new facts that could influence the investigation. In other words, he shifted the responsibility for gathering evidence onto the parents. Many public figures, whether politicians or simply celebrities, commented on the case. The well-known psychiatrist Maria Cordero visited the city in September 2001 in connection with her participation in a psychiatric congress. When asked about the case, she said, "May the families of the missing girls forgive me, but I'm sure they left home in search of a better economic future." She believed the poor living conditions had driven them to leave. Cordero made this statement before the girls' bodies were recovered from abandoned mines and garbage dumps. On October 3, 2001, events occurred that changed the course of the investigation. A local egg supplier was driving his truck along the road, connecting Iquique to Route 5, when, around noon, he saw a girl walking alone by the roadside. She appeared thin, dirty, and confused. The man didn't hesitate to stop and ask if she was okay. The 13-year-old girl explained that a man had abused her, thrown her into a deep shaft, and tied her hands. She said she had lost consciousness during the fall, but managed to free her hands when she woke up and made her way to the surface. She then walked to the road to seek help. The girl was brought to the police station and then taken to the regional hospital. An initial medical examination revealed that she had suffered a skull fracture, a broken collarbone, chest bruises, a cut on the front of her head, and a concussion. It was confirmed that she had been a victim of violence. The attending physician was deeply concerned for the girl and urged her to share everything that had happened to her. The girl's name was Barbara, and during police questioning, she recounted how a man, posing as a taxi driver, had offered to drive her to school early in the morning. Barbara agreed, but once in the car, she realized she had made a mistake. At some point, the attacker pulled out a knife and ordered her to sit still, or he would kill her. He then drove her to an abandoned mine in the middle of the desert, where he committed the heinous act. They both got out of the car, and the man forced Barbara to kneel in front of the mine. He told her he had killed people like her before. Barbara was terrified, begging him to let her go, trying to calm him down, but the man ignored her pleas. After a while, he pushed her into the mine shaft and started throwing heavy rocks at her. Several hit her head, and she lost consciousness. It could be said that Barbara was lucky, as she landed on the ledge of a cliff about 10 meters down. Otherwise, she would have fallen to the bottom of the 200-meter deep mine and died instantly. When she woke up, she found herself unable to move because of the rocks the murderer had thrown on her. Barbara waited a few minutes before standing up and trying to free herself. She had lost a lot of blood, her head was shattered, and she fainted several times on the way, but she survived and walked 4 kilometers to seek help. The next day, Barbara's mother filed a complaint for kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. As a result, the police launched an operation to arrest the suspect. There were suspicions that the attacker was not only a rapist, but also a serial killer. None of the police officers involved in the operation had experience with such cases, as serial killers were extremely rare in Chile. They had to rely on the word of the girl who had miraculously survived. Barbara provided details that could be crucial in catching the perpetrator. She described the man as middle-aged, with black-dyed hair, driving a white car, and wearing a shirt with the municipality's logo. She also remembered that 2 small stuffed animals from the children's TV show Bananas in Pajamas were hanging from the rearview mirror. The following morning, police officers at a checkpoint stopped a white vehicle. The description of the suspected rapist and murderer had already been distributed to all officers in the area. The patrol officers asked the driver to get out of the car and noticed the same banana figures hanging from the mirror. The driver, 37-year-old Julio Perez Silva, didn't appear nervous. The officers informed him that he needed to come to the police station because of an issue with his license plate. Silva willingly agreed, making no attempt to flee or explain himself. However, once at the station, his confidence vanished when he learned that he had been arrested for an alleged rape the previous day. Barbara recognized the suspect in a video provided by the police, filmed while he was in his cell. She also identified his white Mazda Capella, the bananas in pajamas figures, and the homemade knife he had used to threaten her. Within hours, Silva underwent hair, semen, and blood tests, as well as psychological evaluations, and his fingerprints were taken. Under pressure from the authorities, the accused admitted to having had consensual relations with Barbara, which was itself a serious crime, given that she was a minor. However, he denied attempting to kill her or being involved in the disappearances and murders of the other girls. Meanwhile, police searched Silva's house, where he lived with his partner Nancy Boiro and her daughters. They were shocked when the police arrived. During the search, a shirt with the municipality's logo, previously described by Barbara in her statement, was found. Julio had been in custody for just 24 hours when the news of his arrest hit the front pages of all the local newspapers. The police hurried to inform President Ricardo Lagos that a suspect had been arrested in connection with the missing girls and that he might be a serial killer. This could have meant that all the public claims by the authorities suggesting that the missing girls had run away to engage in illegal activities were false and exposed the incompetence of those handling the case. The police continued to pressure Silva, hoping for a confession as soon as possible. However, Silva refused to take the blame. The extreme measures taken by the officers to obtain a confession were, to say the least, controversial. The prisoner was denied food, water, and sleep for 3 days. After a tough interrogation on Sunday, October 7th, Silva finally confessed to killing 3 underage girls and dumping their bodies at the bottom of an abandoned mine. Shortly after, he admitted to more victims, stating that some of the bodies were buried in various garbage dumps. The police tried to conduct their investigation in secret, but information quickly leaked to several national newspapers. The first bodies were found on Tuesday, October 9th, at small garbage dumps around Iquique. Later, Silva himself pointed out where he had hidden some of the children's remains. After the discovery of the first 4 victims, it was decided that their bodies would be sent immediately to the forensic service, as the remains were already in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult. On October 11th, the parents of the missing girls were summoned to the forensic service to identify the remains. Most of the bodies were identified shortly thereafter. The public reaction was swift, and the case shocked the entire nation. Social pressure on law enforcement grew, and it became clear that many of these cases hadn't even been registered in the system. Meanwhile, officers began blaming each other, trying to evade responsibility, which led to the resignation of several high-ranking officials. The case revealed the shortcomings of various government agencies and triggered a political earthquake. For weeks, the news of the serial killer's arrest dominated the front pages of the media. Chile hadn't seen a serial murder case since 1982, when 2 police officers, known as the psychopaths of Villa del Mar, killed 10 people. The funeral of the victims of the so-called psychopath of Alto Hospicio took place on October 15th at the cathedral in Iquique. When the victims' parents returned home, they wondered if they could have done more. Amidst pain and poverty, they had made enormous efforts to find their children alive. They had shown the country what it means to fight for those you love, and had taught the nation to listen to the cries of the suffering with more sensitivity and understanding. Psychiatrists, psychologists, and forensic experts questioned why Silva had committed such brutal crimes. Silva himself couldn't explain it. Julio was a serious man, quiet and even withdrawn, obsessed with cleanliness. At first glance, he seemed friendly, but he never had any friends. Julio Perez Silva was born on July 15, 1963, in the port city of Valparaiso. His former classmates and teachers remembered him as a quiet and calm child. Due to his family's modest financial situation, he was forced to attend school in rubber sandals and without a uniform, which made him the target of constant teasing. Silva's father was an extremely violent man who regularly beat his son and wife. From an early age, Silva was used to being afraid of his father. At the age of 7, Julio fainted for the first time when his father slammed his head against a wall after Julio had entered the room without asking for permission. After that, he tried to avoid his father whenever possible. According to Silva, he was molested by an older boy at the age of 11, but he kept it a secret because he was extremely embarrassed. As a teenager, the future criminal dropped out of school due to poor academic performance and lost interest in studying. From the few memories of those who knew him, Silva's favorite childhood hobby was playing soccer. He regularly participated in neighborhood tournaments and was quite talented with the ball, but as soon as the games ended, he would shower, get dressed, and leave without speaking to anyone. At the age of 22, Julio married, and soon the newlyweds had 2 daughters. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last long. Silva then met another woman who also had 2 young daughters. Those around him said he was an excellent husband and treated the children as if they were his own. He worked regularly and was a friendly neighbor. However, rumors of an alleged attempted rape of one of the girls also ended this relationship. Julio then moved to the northern city of Kacie to start a new life. A few weeks after his move, he met Nancy Boiro, an older woman with 6 daughters. Together they moved to Alto Hospicio, where they later settled in a small, modest house. In mid-1998, Nancy managed to sell a small piece of land in Kacie, and with the proceeds, she decided to buy Julio a used car and pay for driving lessons. At that time, Silva worked as a laborer loading salt bags and earned very little. The financial situation became increasingly difficult, so Julio decided to earn extra money as an unlicensed taxi driver. Around the same time, a series of disappearances began in the region. Some of Silva's neighbors recalled that he was always vacuuming and cleaning the inside of his car, but they didn't think much of it. According to Julio, his first crime was committed without any plan. He claimed he had met an underage girl who agreed to engage in intimate relations with him for money. When they reached a secluded beach, Silva allegedly realized that his companion had no intention of doing anything and only wanted to steal the money from his glove compartment. In a fit of rage, Silva attacked the girl, hitting her in the face with a rock until she died. A gold medal with the emblem of a soccer team, which Silva's partner had given him, was found at the crime scene. Unfortunately, this information only came to light after the case became widely known. The police officer working at the scene simply took the medal, assuming it had no connection to the crime. This action further highlighted the low qualifications of some police officers. Thanks to his car, Silva could move freely around different parts of the city, offering rides to teenage girls. He targeted young girls who agreed to get into his car under the pretext of giving them a ride along the desolate streets of Alto Hospicio. After several psychiatric and psychological evaluations, it was determined that Julio Silva suffered from antisocial personality disorder and displayed severe antisocial behavior that prevented him from forming emotional connections with others. Despite this diagnosis, Silva seemed outwardly friendly. He was sometimes able to hold conversations with those he met. His partner Nancy, for example, claimed that he was loving, open, and attentive in their relationship, giving her massages and even bringing her breakfast in bed. She also said he had never been aggressive. The only strange behavior Nancy noticed was catching Julio several times, staring nervously and excitedly at other women. As the investigation continued, more bodies of missing girls who had disappeared between April 1999 and August 2001 in the Alto Hospicio area were found. However, Silva denied knowing anything about them. On February 26, 2002, Julio Perez Silva was found guilty of 14 murders and 1 attempted murder. Throughout the entire trial, the defendant showed no emotion, expressed no remorse, and never apologized to the families of his victims. He maintained his innocence, claiming that the police officers had framed him and coerced him into confessing. Silva stated that on the day of his arrest, he had been beaten and tortured by the police until he couldn't bear the pain anymore and decided to accept the accusations against him. Given such serious claims, the authorities assumed Silva had lost his mind and was simply lying. However, it was clear that some people remained unconvinced. Soon, various rumors began circulating in the country's information channels. One of the darkest rumors surrounding the case was that Barbara, the only surviving victim, had been involved in a romantic relationship with Julio and had helped him lure other girls into his car for abduction. The families of the victims refused to believe this and publicly expressed their trust and support for Barbara. Reports suggest that Barbara was never able to finish high school. As a result, she eventually left the city and was said to have lived in poverty on the streets. Julio Perez Silva was initially incarcerated at the Tapar prison, but was later moved to solitary confinement in another prison in the capital region. 4 guards monitor his every move around the clock to prevent him from committing suicide, which he had attempted several times. Despite his unpredictable behavior, Silva occasionally behaves well, listening to music, watching movies, and making crafts. He is also allowed to play soccer with the prison staff a few times a month. He has never been placed in the general population of the prison, as it would be impossible for him to survive there. Other inmates had already sworn to kill him at the first opportunity. The families of the victims have yet to receive a proper apology from the authorities. President Ricardo Lagos granted them modest houses of barely more than 50 square meters and laughable lifetime payments of $200 as compensation. Thank you for watching and take care. Rob McLeod began every morning by looking at his daughter's website. She had disappeared in August 2003, a spirited, beautiful young woman who was 19 at the time. This tragedy was a cruel ordeal for the missing girl's parents, but it turned out she was far from the only victim in the story of a dangerous criminal. Today, we want to tell the story of the innocent victims of an incredibly dangerous man who hid his cruelties behind his cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Kacie McLeod was born in 1984 in the state of Colorado. Her parents' names were Rob and Lori McLeod. Having had a child during their marriage, they devoted all their warmth and care to their daughter. Until her adolescence, the girl grew up carefree, completely shielded from the dangers and difficulties of the modern world. However, this carefree life of Kacie did not last long. Later, her parents divorced, and she lived with her mother from then on. Her father often communicated with her during this time. The girl was 4 years old then. She was a cheerful, happy, bright child. The boundless love and care of her mother and father led, as she grew older, to a spoiled, unruly character that manifested itself during puberty. In high school, the girl fell into bad company, began smoking, quarreled with her mother, and behaved inappropriately. It was a rebellious teenage spirit that was received extremely negatively by her mother. The woman was tired of arguing with her daughter. At some point, she couldn't take it anymore, packed her daughter's things, and moved with her to Arizona to let her live with her aunt for a while. Kacie's new home was Phoenix. Here, her behavior normalized. The girl met Tobita Martin, with whom she got along well, and over time they became best friends. At this point, they were both 16 years old. From the first days of their friendship, the girls understood each other perfectly. They were very close, went to school together, worked together in a restaurant, and spent almost all their free time together. According to Tobita, her friend got into bad company after graduation. There, she became addicted to smoking and began bringing dubious characters home. When her best friend Tobita noticed this, she called her aunt, with whom Kacie was living, and told her about the problems. She then informed her mother, who immediately got into her car and drove to her daughter's house. The contact between her and Tobita did not break off but became even stronger. Tobita was very worried about her friend, so they remained in constant contact and cared for each other, even when they were far apart. As it turned out, Kacie had been smoking illegal substances for months. In her opinion, she was a victim of circumstances, unlike ordinary addicts. She believed that she would be able to get her problem under control. After living with her father for several months, she came to her senses and returned to her mother. It turned out that during the time Kacie was being cared for by her father, her mother had met a new man named Scott and was with him. This man was charming, loving, and caring. Life seemed to be getting better, and they began to live together. She got a new job and had long since separated from her bad company, in which she had been addicted to drugs. But after some time, the lie was uncovered. The parents found illegal substances in the house, and there was a serious conflict between them and their daughter. Kacie claimed that she was not taking drugs, but that they apparently came from her old stash. The now 19-year-old young woman was convincing in her words and even agreed to undergo a test, but her parents could no longer believe the young rebel with addiction problems. The mother and stepfather threatened their daughter with turning her over to the police. There was a heated argument, whereupon Kacie grabbed her bicycle and rode off to an unknown destination and did not return for a long time. The mother was worried. She drove around searching for her daughter but could not find her. This time, however, she had not just run away without reason, but after a serious argument. She had had similar outbursts of anger and tantrums before, which greatly upset her parents, but she always came back quickly. This time, her mother's heart felt that something disturbing had happened. Kacie's biological father, Rob, learned from his ex-wife that his daughter had disappeared. The man was very worried, as he also participated in the search for his daughter and just wanted her to come home as she had done before. However, 2 days had already passed, and Kacie had still not returned. She didn't even show up for her shift at the diner where she worked. This finally worried the parents so much that Lori and Rob involved the police. Contrary to expectations, the police officers were not in a hurry to start searching for the missing woman. The police told the parents that they actually had no right to search for their daughter, that she was already 19 years old and could leave the house at will. She could do whatever she wanted and was not considered missing, according to the police. To file a missing person report, there must be suspicion that someone has committed a crime. The investigators believed that Kacie was somewhere with friends and would return later, and they did not want to waste their resources on a troubled teenager. This police response left the family of the missing girl at a dead end. The only support the worried mother still had was her partner, Scott. It turned out that he had connections to law enforcement because the man was an FBI informant and helped catch criminals. When Lori talked to Scott about her daughter, he assured her that she would definitely be found. The man used his connections and actually helped Lori. The police finally began to investigate Kacie's disappearance, and some clues were found, including the discovery that the missing Kacie had returned to her mother's house after her disappearance when no one was there. This was confirmed by a necklace that had been left on the doorknob of her bedroom. She always carried it with her. She had disappeared and then suddenly reappeared. Later, the stepfather also spoke with neighbors, and one of them said she had seen the missing girl just a few days after her disappearance. The neighbor confirmed that she had seen her in the company of Kacie herself, her boyfriend, and the sister of the boyfriend. During this time, Tobita, the best friend of the missing girl, also participated in the search. She called everyone who might know Kacie, but no one had seen her. Tobita traveled to the city where Kacie lived and participated in the search operation organized by the relatives of the missing girl. Then she set up a social media page for her friend to receive information about her. Tobita also shared flyers with pictures of her best friend that described her. The mother was so grateful to her new lover for his involvement and help in the search that she agreed to marry him, for he was her only hope and support in a difficult moment, and they began to live like a real family. The man continued to support Lori and kept her going. They made every possible effort to search for her. In this state, weeks and then months passed. It took over a year to realize that Kacie had not really run away. Everyone was already sure that something much worse had happened to her. Tobita was sure that her friend had had an accident and was in trouble because otherwise she would have contacted her at the first opportunity. They had a close friendship and had never fallen out to the point where the relationship had broken down. Kacie would not have ignored her. During this time, the mother of the missing girl also began to describe the worst scenarios that could have happened to her daughter. At this point, the father of the young, rebellious Kacie and her best friend were frequently calling each other and analyzing various possibilities, and they began to wonder whether the key to Kacie's disappearance might be closer to her home and family than previously assumed. they had their first suspicions. The questions that occupied Rob McLeod were where his daughter was, whether she was okay, and whether it made sense to wait for her at home. What the man did not know was that another father from Colorado named Howard Emery had exactly the same feelings. He lived near their city and had lost contact with his daughter in a similarly mysterious way, but much earlier than Kacie disappeared. His daughter was named Len Emery and disappeared at the age of 24, only 7 months before Kacie's disappearance. Howard went over the events in his head that had preceded the incidents. His daughter had been an excellent student. She had even managed to graduate from high school a year earlier than planned and went to college, where she stood out for her intellectual abilities. But then the young woman began to have difficulties. Her mother had health problems that prevented her from finishing college. Len had to take care of her mother and help her, so she dropped out of her studies. She also lost her promising job as a veterinary assistant, and her life went downhill. But at that time, nothing mattered to her except her mother's health. She dreamed of making her mother healthy again, and then planned to get her other problems under control, resume her studies, and find a new job. But life held new surprises for her. The compliant Len met an abusive boyfriend and fell completely under the influence of the manipulator. She married him. Her husband beat her, gave her no opportunity to communicate with her family, and kept her completely under control. According to the father, the daughter began to have psychological problems during this time due to this series of failures and manipulations by her husband. The woman believed she was nothing and could not achieve what she dreamed of. Her husband suppressed Len and reduced her self-esteem to a minimum. In the end, however, the woman found the strength and left the domestic tyrant. Her marriage broke up in 2002, but that didn't make things any easier. Len's father was worried that his daughter began a relationship with another bad guy, an ex-convict named Stephen Hawley. At the same time, Len became interested in caving. This became a mental outlet for her and an opportunity to find something new and change her life from scratch. On January 16, 2003, Len set off in her car from her parents' house on a trip. She wanted to go with her friends to Mexico to do speleology with a group of professionals. However, only 2 weeks passed, and Len's father received a call from the sheriff's office of Utah. The man was informed that his daughter's car had been found off the highways in a canyon. The car could be identified by the license plate, as the owner had a great fondness for Dalmatian dogs, which was also reflected in the unique inscription on the license plate. According to the police officer, most of his daughter's belongings were still in the car, Len's clothing and everything else, including equipment, but there was no trace of the woman. That seemed disturbing enough. The sheriff told Howard everything he could find out during the investigation of the scene. It looked as if Len had deliberately driven off the road and directly into the canyon. There were a series of boot prints and tire tracks from another vehicle. Everything indicated that the young caver had gotten out of her car and into another one. However, some of the tracks were trampled, as if some kind of struggle had taken place here. The sheriff suspected that something might have happened to the woman, as if she had been kidnapped. Howard rushed to the police station to report his daughter's disappearance near his home in Colorado. However, the man was also turned away, as they believed that his daughter was just having fun somewhere and would return home later. Therefore, the father was forced to conduct his own investigations. The man first checked the transaction history of the woman's bank card and collected all the other data he could find. Based on the payment records, he was able to reconstruct her route, where she had traveled in the weeks before the call from the police station. Howard was confused, as everything indicated that she was leading a double life. She had not traveled to Mexico, but had spent the 10 days before the call traveling around the western states. During this time, she had issued numerous forged checks and spent thousands of dollars using her father's credit card. This was completely uncharacteristic of Len. She was frugal and modest in her expenses, and the card had been given to her by her father for emergencies when she might need money. Therefore, the man was sure that she was either being blackmailed or intimidated through threats, or that the money from the card had been withdrawn by someone else. The daughter simply could not have done all this alone and spent so much money. Howard was able to access her email account during his investigation and found out that Len had sent several emails to her cousin a few days before her departure. There were hints of problems, but Len assured her cousin that she was protected by a certain Hannibal and that everything was okay. The father didn't understand at all who they were talking about. At that time, her boyfriend Stephen, whom the woman had met after separating from her abusive husband, was still in prison, where he was serving a sentence for illegal substance trafficking. The father visited Stephen in prison to talk to him. Perhaps he could give him some clues. The friend told him that Hannibal was the nickname of one of his acquaintances, and he was a very violent man. If Len got involved with him, she was in great danger. He immediately advised him to notify the police. Hannibal was a former cellmate of his. He could kill a person very quickly and easily, and he knew many people who would not hesitate to kill the woman on his behalf. However, the friend of the missing woman refused, despite the father's pleas, to reveal the identity of this mysterious Hannibal, as he feared for his life. The alarmed Howard then did not turn to the police, who ignored his statement, but to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He told the FBI agents everything he knew about Hannibal, but they didn't believe him either, as they thought everything was just made up. The father's concerns were once again ignored, and the FBI did not pursue the case of the missing 24-year-old woman. Both fathers continued their own investigations. The discovery of Hannibal's mysterious identity, however, gave these independent investigations new impetus. Later, it turned out that this mysterious stranger worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and was married to Lori McLeod, the mother of the missing Kacie. It turned out that Hannibal's real name was Scott Kimble. Even Lori herself had begun to suspect his involvement in her daughter's disappearance at that time. Her doubts emerged only much later after the wedding. From time to time, he made eerie jokes and said strange things that scared the woman, and she had questions for her new husband. Lori often had the feeling that something was wrong with her new husband. He gave confusing answers to all questions related to the missing daughter, and then the woman found Scott's work uniform and Casey's personal diary while searching his things, which should not have been in his possession. Amazingly, it took a whole 6 months before the ex-wife informed Rob McLeod that Kacie had not only been missing for an entire weekend when she was last seen, but that Scott himself had left on the same days, which later led her to suspect his involvement in the possible crime. These were not the only events related to the man that worried those who knew him. At the beginning of 2006, he was involved in a criminal case being investigated in Lafayette, Colorado. The police first became aware of him when they were investigating a case of check fraud. Scott had connections to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as he was a criminal informant. Furthermore, it turned out that the man was a con artist who had spent most of his life in prisons in the western United States. However, it was not possible to catch Hannibal while he was on the run. A warrant would have been issued for the arrest of the suspected informant, but it took more than 2 months to track the man down. The arrest required participation in a massive chase that took place along the Coachella Valley in California. The criminal could finally be stopped and arrested. The experienced criminal, however, did not want to give up even when he was handcuffed. Unfortunately, the investigations into the involvement of the prisoner in several cases of the disappearance of young women did not begin immediately after the investigators' work. Another name was added to the list of missing persons in which the man might be involved. The name of the third missing person was Jennifer Markham. She had disappeared several years earlier from the view of family and friends. It also happened in Colorado. The 25-year-old Jennifer Markham was a single mother who earned her living as a dancer in a nightclub. She was waiting for her imprisoned boyfriend from places not too far away. His name was Steve Ennis. Shortly after this event, Jennifer also disappeared. Her father, Bob, did not understand what had happened to his daughter, but suspected that Jenny might have been in trouble or even behind bars. Only a year after the police report did her father receive a call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, informing him that his daughter might be in trouble. She herself had not yet been found, but her car had been found abandoned at Denver Airport. The parents found out that the authorities had discovered the woman's car much earlier than they had been told. They continued to demand answers from the investigators, and then Jennifer's mother was given the opportunity to contact Scott Kimble. The informant said that the daughter of the Markhams had been killed by an illegal drug dealer who was involved with her boyfriend. He said the missing woman had been tied up and strangled. But the most frightening thing was the end of the conversation with Scott. He said he could take the mother of the murdered woman to the mountains the next day and show her where her body was. However, the parents of the missing woman did not accept this offer. They were afraid of him and literally believed that this would be their last journey. In any case, the father was certain at the end of the conversation that it was the informant who had killed his daughter, and that he wanted to get rid of them by suggesting they go into the mountains. And all because he spoke with a frighteningly threatening voice and told everything in such detail as if he had been there and seen everything with his own eyes. Jennifer's parents went to the police officers to express their suspicion, but no one wanted to listen to them because the investigators trusted Kimble, who had been working for them for a long time and had a certain level of trust. And this time, the parents had to take the investigation into Jennifer's disappearance into their own hands. The father ordered a small billboard with a photo of his daughter, which he set up near the nightclub where his daughter danced. In this way, they hoped to receive information, and it worked. In June 2006, Rob McLeod, the father of the missing Kacie, happened to come across the story of Jennifer's father. He recognized his billboard and read it. The story of Jennifer's disappearance bore great resemblance to the story of his daughter's disappearance, so the man contacted him. In the course of the conversation, Rob McLeod learned some shocking facts. He heard the name of Scott Kimble, which had been mentioned by Jennifer's parents. Rob also suspected that Scott had something to do with Kacie's disappearance, so they arranged a meeting to go over all the details and work together on the investigation. Later, they met the father of the missing Len Emery and also worked with him. Scott was also involved in their case. After that, Rob met with his ex-wife, Lori. He immediately asked her whether there had been other cases of strange behavior by her husband and mysterious disappearances of people during her time together with Scott. The woman quickly remembered that in 2004, Scott's uncle Terry Kimble had also disappeared. She also found that strange. After that, the families of the missing had a big trump card in their hands with which they could turn to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They reported to the office in Denver and shared their suspicions regarding the perpetrator, Scott Kimble. The relatives were sure that he was behind the disappearance of the women. Finally, the law enforcement officers listened to them and agreed that there were too many peculiarities in these cases, and all the threads led to Scott. So the agents reacted and began investigating instead of ignoring the whole series of disappearances. The investigations officially began only in the fall of 2006. In all these cases, the investigation revealed that Scott Kimble was driven by greed. The man wanted money, attention, and power. At that time, he was still in prison awaiting his trial for fraud. The investigators began talking to an informant from the Central Bureau of Investigation who was willing to show them the most sophisticated cat-and-mouse game they had encountered in their entire career. Scott lied constantly to confuse investigations. In one of his stories, he said that his uncle had fled to Mexico with a dancer after winning the lottery. When checking this information, the investigators found that he had not won anything and no payment had been made to him. They also found out that the uncle had some money before his disappearance. The uncle had earned some money after the divorce. The man constantly carried a briefcase with him containing several $1,000s that he had gotten his hands on. This seems to be the cause of his death. The second victim in chronological order was the dancer Jennifer Markham. She and Scott found out about each other when he was in the same cell as her boyfriend. It was in 2002. He saw pictures of the beauty and fell in love with her almost immediately. He began to assure his cellmate that he would like to help her find a normal, well-paying job, and the cellmate gave him the opportunity to help. But his real motive was to possess this woman entirely. At that time, Kimble convinced law enforcement that Jennifer and his cellmate were part of a criminal plan. He claimed to have uncovered a criminal gang involved in contract killings. Amazingly, the FBI agents believed the criminal. He was released in December 2002 and began working as an informant. Only 2 months later, Jennifer disappeared. During the investigation, the police officers spoke with Steve Ennis, who was Jennifer's boyfriend. He reported at the time that he suspected Scott and also believed that Scott was involved in the disappearance of the girlfriend of another ex-convict. His name was Steve Hawley, who was together with Len, and she had also disappeared. The investigators tried to contact her, but since 2003, this was no longer possible due to her disappearance. The investigators realized that she was another victim of Kimble. Len's photo was found on Scott Kimble's laptop. However, the law enforcement authorities had no bodies of the missing, no evidence, and no confession from the perpetrator himself. They continued to literally extract information from him, piece by piece. In April 2008, Scott finally gave a small clue. According to him, he was with a woman who died of an overdose of illegal substances in a national forest in Colorado. The police had a parking receipt indicating that Scott Kimble was in Walden, Colorado, near the national forest, on the weekend when Kacie McLeod disappeared. It seems that he disposed of bodies in the area. The investigators then contacted the Forest Service and tried to find out whether bodies had been found there and whether they had received similar reports. The dispatcher replied that there had been no such incidents, except for what had happened in the winter. A skull had been found there. After investigation, it turned out to be Kacie McLeod. However, no further remains could be found, and the cause of death could not be determined based on the skull alone. From that point on, Kacie's disappearance was finally treated as a murder case, and Scott became the main suspect. Scott Kimble was born in 1976 in Boulder, Colorado, into a broken family, which made his childhood extremely turbulent. He survived his parents' divorce and even had his first encounter with the police as a teenager when he fired a gun through his neighbor's window. When Scott and his brother moved into their grandmother's house, the neighbor raped them both, leading to Scott's psychological problems. He even tried to take his own life and shot himself in the head at the age of 23, but he was lucky. The bullet only grazed his skull, and paramedics saved his life. At the beginning of his criminal career, Scott was involved in several petty crimes, including credit card fraud. In his private life, he was unlucky. Scott married Larissa Huns in 1993. The couple had 2 sons, but the marriage could not be saved due to constant quarrels and conflicts. They divorced in 1997. Scott believed that the whole world was against him, and this was, as psychiatrists later believed, the main reason for the murders. The ex-wife later accused Scott of stealing from and raping her, but she failed a lie detector test, and her accusations were considered invalid. Nevertheless, he was soon arrested and imprisoned for fraud. After escaping from prison, Scott returned to his ex-wife to rape her a second time, although the rape report was never filed. When Scott was arrested in Alaska, he stood trial in connection with his escape. During his detention in Alaska, Scott convinced the FBI that he would spy for them, so he got away with a light sentence. However, this deal was extremely reckless because, after his release, Scott committed 4 heinous murders. Kacie's mother, Lori, was shocked, for she had literally married the monster that had taken her daughter away from her and didn't even notice it for a long time. How could this man charm her with his charisma? But as everything came to a head, she divorced him. Lori believed that it was Scott who had planted illegal substances on the day she last saw her daughter, that he had started the argument because he knew that the impulsive Kacie would leave the house and he would get a good opportunity to bring her to her senses. So far, however, the entire case was based on speculation. There was too little evidence against him, all of which could be dismissed as circumstantial and easily refuted with the help of a good lawyer. An extensive collection of evidence was required before the informant of the Federal Bureau of Investigation could be brought to trial. That changed in 2008 when Kimble was sentenced to 48 years in prison for his recent fraud and assault offenses. But the prosecutors wanted more. They wanted to hold him accountable for all the brutal murders he had been involved in. But that required more than just interrogations. So the law enforcement authorities offered the man a deal with a reduced sentence if he would lead the police officers to the bodies of his victims. Scott finally agreed, and in the winter of 2009, showed the locations in the canyons of eastern Utah where the remains of Kacie and Jennifer could be found. A thorough search led the police officers to a single boulder lying in the canyon. Under the rock were found bones and a hairpin of a woman with a torn strand of hair. The forensic examination revealed that these were the remains of Kacie, who had been lying on the lonely rock ledge for 6 years. Among the remains was also a bullet that was identical to one fired from Scott's weapon. The intruder then helped to discover the body of his uncle in this canyon, who had also been shot. However, there was a problem in searching for Jennifer's remains. The investigators searched the entire area indicated by Scott, but found nothing. It turned out that the perpetrator's story about the whereabouts of Jennifer Markham's body was entirely fabricated. Scott wanted to convince the police that he was not lying and telling the truth about Jennifer Markham's burial, and even went so far as to undergo a lie detector test. He suspected that her body had been found by someone and re-hidden. However, the investigators believed that he deliberately prevented them from finding Jennifer's body because he had a special connection to her. In any case, in October 2009, the families of the killer's victims gathered in court. Finally, they could see the Hannibal who had taken their daughters' lives from the front row. The parents of the murdered testified and complained to Scott that he had ruined their lives. Scott Kimble was charged with second-degree murder. As part of a deal, he pleaded guilty to being involved in the murders of 4 people. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2082. In his case, he will probably spend the rest of his life behind bars. In his speech, the perpetrator emphasized that he was not a serial killer. Scott admitted that he had only killed his uncle Terry and was only indirectly involved in the death of the women. He spoke in riddles about his female victims and did not explain what it all meant. The defendant referred to them as part of a mechanism, but did not reveal what exactly it was and how it worked. It was clearly some kind of criminal plan. The circumstances suggested that they had died of an overdose, but there were great doubts about that. Scott had even said that he had help but refused to reveal which other people were involved in the events. What the prosecutor had not anticipated was that the reason for this was simple. They simply did not exist. According to forensic psychiatrists, the man had killed the women due to an unhealthy sexual attraction. For this reason, it was difficult for him to talk about it, and he also did not consider it murder. The search for Jennifer Markham's body continued even after Scott's conviction. However, her body was never found. The sons of Scott Kimble gave an interview and openly revealed that their father tried to kill one of his sons, Justin, when he was 10 years old. His father hit him on the head with a metal object, and he lost consciousness. Then he drove him to the hospital and tried to throw him out of the car at full speed. The boy suffered severe injuries and was placed in an artificial coma, which he miraculously survived. When Justin came to and told the story, no one believed him. The now adult son realized that his father wanted a payout from his life insurance, or $50,000 from the boy's insurance policy. He was the sole beneficiary. Scott Kimble is suspected of being involved in several other women's murders that were committed in Colorado at that time. According to the police, he may have killed 25 people. The bodies of some of the victims were found with a series of knots on a rope that resembled the knots Kimble used in the murder of his Uncle Terry. One of the women was wrapped in a baby blanket, identified by Scott's son. Thus, the investigators are confident that there were many more victims. Thank you for watching and take care of yourself. Greed is one of the most common reasons for murder within one's own household. Sometimes what we call youthful recklessness goes too far, and unfortunately, the realization that control has been lost often comes too late. Robert Pointer was described as a kind man who simply couldn't leave anyone in need. His children always came first on the father's list. The man had 3 daughters. The youngest, Grace, from his second marriage, was 6 years old at the time of the events described. During his time living with his first wife, Natalie and Nicole were born, who were already adults. After living with his first wife for about 20 years, she began to notice changes in his behavior. His wife, Amy Pointer, began to have justified suspicions. The father started leaving the house, spending more time away from his loved ones. Soon, the eldest daughter, Nicole, discovered that her father had a second mobile phone. As it turned out, he was secretly involved with another woman named Kacie Tyler. At the time she met Robert, Kacie worked as a nurse. They knew each other through a mutual friend. The woman fell in love with Robert at first sight and decided to marry him, even though the man was married and had children. He seemed serious and reliable to her, and it was easy to be with him. Kacie quickly found out that Robert was having problems in the marriage. After that, Kacie kept coming to the fire station to chat with the man. His comrades and close friends jokingly referred to the woman's behavior as stalking. Despite a 20-year marriage, Robert succumbed to the temptation to start an affair with her and then left his first wife, Amy. In December 2007, the man officially began dating Kacie, and in May 2009, she became pregnant. On December 28th of the same year, they celebrated a wedding. At that time, Robert was already 40 years old, and his young wife was only 22. She told everyone around her that she was very happy with her husband. Unfortunately, the fairy tale did not come true. After 7 years, the feelings eventually faded. Now she realized that marriage was generally a bad idea for her. The woman described her affair with Robert as a foolishness and a youthful mistake, but she went too far because it involved the marital bond and a child. On September 9th, 2016, the emergency service 911 received a call from a woman who could hardly control herself. She seemed on the verge of hysteria. She screamed into the phone and demanded that the authorities arrive as quickly as possible on a rural road 38 kilometers from the city, where she was in the car with her husband. The complainant kept repeating that she was worried about her husband and wanted to know that he was okay. When the officers arrived at the crime scene around midnight, they saw a lone vehicle next to which a 29-year-old woman stood. She had blood on her shoulder and body, but it didn't look like she had been injured. According to Kacie Pointer, she had been holding her spouse's head the entire time she waited for the police, begging him to regain consciousness. The young woman did not leave his side for a minute, but as soon as she saw the patrol officers, she immediately rushed to them to show them the situation and ask for help for her husband. She still hoped that he was okay. In the passenger compartment of the car was the injured Robert Pointer. The car was smeared with blood. Upon examination, it turned out that the blood on Kacie's shoulder, blouse, and legs did not come from her. She was unharmed. Her spouse in the passenger compartment was far less fortunate. The police officers immediately noticed a gunshot wound to the head. According to the woman, she saw a certain intruder in dark clothing who suddenly attacked and shot her husband. There were no signs of a struggle in the cabin, but Kacie feared that the incident could repeat itself and feared for her life but could not get off the road as the vehicle was stuck. Moreover, her husband obviously needed help. When the paramedics arrived, Robert was unfortunately already dead. There was nothing more that could be done for him. It was a night that Kacie will never forget. It took her a long time to calm down after the police arrived. Her lungs began to hyperventilate. Kacie couldn't understand who could have attacked her in the darkness of the night. Her husband was a decent man who had worked as a firefighter for many years and had risen to the rank of captain. As the woman admitted, she had not seen the stranger's face and could not give any clues as to who it might have been. According to her, it was a darkly dressed man who was significantly taller than herself. She was breathing very heavily and could not control her shortness of breath or pull herself together. One of the paramedics helped her to normalize and stabilize her breathing, after which the witness was finally able to recount the events before the murder. That evening, the 29-year-old Kacie was on her way to meet her husband to eat tacos at a fast food restaurant. The woman was on a country road in Royce City, Texas, USA. Normally, she did not use this road, but this time she was late and had taken a wrong turn. In the darkness, she missed the correct turnoff, drove 5 kilometers away from it, and when she noticed her mistake, she decided not to turn back and drove on. She saw a country road leading into a field. The woman thought she could take a shortcut that way, but suddenly she was stuck. In the darkness, Kacie did not notice the deep tractor rut that the rain had left and washed out in the mud. It was not even a country road, but a path used by farmers with tractors. It was strange that Kacie had chosen this path, which was clearly unsuitable for her purposes. It was also unclear how she could run into a criminal in the middle of nowhere. The woman called her husband and learned that he was not far from this place and asked him for help. Of course, he hurried to help her. The man quickly reached the place and drove toward the ditch. Kacie waited for him at the edge of the road and showed him the spot where her car was. He left the car at the roadside, went toward his wife's vehicle, and ventured deeper into the darkness. The woman stayed where she was. A few minutes later, Kacie heard a shot. She realized that Robert might be injured and hurried into the darkness, where she saw her wounded husband slump on the passenger seat. He had a large gunshot wound on the right side of his skull. Robert was dead on the spot. There was no way to save him. Then she ran to her husband's car to call for help and noticed in the distance, where a few trees grew, a suspicious dark silhouette. The woman was sure that it was the murderer. Kacie feared for her life because she realized that this man could have no reason to kill her husband, and she feared that she would be the shooter's next victim. At the same time, she didn't want to leave Robert alone, so she cautiously called for help and went to him. The 47-year-old Robert Pointer was a respected officer who had made a career as a firefighter. His comrades, who worked at the fire station near University Park in Dallas, Texas, could not believe what had happened. The man had fought fires for 19 years, became a captain, and saved dozens of lives. The man's death was a severe blow to his children and his family. The youngest girl dreamed about her father almost every night. Now the investigators had to find out who was behind the crime. September 9th, 2016 was a severe blow for Kacie, as she told the police. The young firefighter had been in a state of confusion for a long time and made confused and incoherent statements under the video cameras of the arriving officers. Nevertheless, the police officers immediately suspected that her words were lies. Her story sounded implausible and bizarre, and the actual meaning was not clear to the police. On a remote country road used only by local farmers and in such a muddy area, a mysterious intruder had somehow decided out of the blue to kill a stranger. He had attacked Robert at the exact moment he first entered the field. What would prevent him from firing a second shot and killing Kacie? To the police officers, none of this made sense. There was no struggle, no forewarning of an attack. The murderer had simply stepped silently out of the darkness and shot the fire captain in the head, hitting him in the temple. Still in the patrol car, Kacie spoke quite openly about her marriage and relationship history with Robert. Eventually, she reported that the problems had started years ago, that the marriage was broken and on the verge of collapse. The main problem was Robert's desire to take their daughter away from her in the event of a divorce. The young mother was convinced that he did this maliciously because she was aware that this was the development that would hurt her spouse the most. She talked with the police officers for over an hour. The longer it took, the more details she added to her story, not only about her relationship with her deceased husband, but also about the details of the attack. The officers noticed that Kacie kept coming back to the topic of her marriage. Considering that Robert's body was still lying in a car nearby at that time, this communication seemed increasingly strange and fascinating. It was obvious that her husband's death did not bother her at all. It was as if the widow was trying to build an alibi out of nothing. The police officers decided to listen to the woman to the end to get more information. According to Kacie, the marriage broke down 3 years after the wedding. They even began sleeping in separate rooms. The widow complained that she felt no true love and was sure that she still loved her husband and that the feelings were mutual. Then she began to claim that Robert was an abusive man. That was because he injected himself with testosterone to balance his low level of the male hormone. This made Robert even more aggressive. He repeatedly used physical violence against his young wife. She insisted that the man humiliated her in every possible way, from verbal to physical assaults. The investigators finally decided to release the widow until the facts were clarified, but ordered that she be placed under observation. Kacie became the first suspect in this case. The investigators later spoke with Robert's first wife, who did not confirm any of Kacie's claims. She knew that her former husband had no testosterone problems, and that violence and hot temper fundamentally contradicted this man's nature. This was confirmed not only by his children and his family, but also by his entire environment, including his colleagues. An important confirmation came from his daughter, Natalie, who said that at the age of 16, she lived with her father and stepmother for about 6 months, separated from her mother. According to her, during this time, she had not once experienced her father losing control, let alone being violent. All this was confirmed by the other daughters of the deceased. Later, Kacie tried to refute these statements by insisting that the daughters of the first wife had been hostile to her from the beginning because they considered her a bad woman. Kacie claimed she had not reported the domestic violence to the police because she did not want to endanger Robert's career. The young widow insisted that she tried to keep the relationship alive and even bring something new into the marriage. However, it turned out that this new was not exactly what one would normally try to regain a loved one. In conversations with other acquaintances and relatives of Robert, it emerged that Kacie had been unfaithful to him. She said that since December 2013, she began to actively engage in regular sports, running, eating properly, which allowed her to lose almost 50 pounds in 2 years. This was a great success, but according to her, Robert was attracted to more voluptuous women, so her husband stopped liking her as before after the weight loss. She didn't want to gain weight again, but decided to behave differently and had a few affairs on the side to make him jealous. At the next interrogation at the police station, she confessed to adultery, and then another, and another. It turned out that these adulteries were systematic and were confirmed by the statements of Robert's daughters. One day, Natalie accidentally found evidence of the betrayal on her stepmother's computer. The woman had left a tab open in the social networks where she was corresponding with several men at the same time and was chatting openly and quite intimately. After that, Natalie began to notice that her stepmother often went away for a few hours while her father took the night shift at the fire station. Meanwhile, her little sister woke up at night cried and called for her mother. It became obvious that Kacie was regularly cheating on her husband, and Natalie had had enough of it. The eldest daughter was outraged and told her father everything, providing clear evidence. That was a severe blow for the man, who got upset about it and even filed for divorce, but then changed his mind and didn't go through with it. Instead, Robert decided to try to save the marriage. According to the deceased's children, he didn't want to separate from Kacie because of his little daughter. The man tried to build a relationship, but nothing worked. When Robert installed a surveillance camera near the front door 12 days before the murder, hoping to catch Kacie cheating or refute Natalie's suspicions, the cameras recorded a strange man with the firefighter's wife. In fact, the investigators' suspicion had been aroused long before the end of the first interrogation in the patrol car. Kacie even had her driver's license taken away, although she was not arrested or charged. Despite the police officer's mistrust, she continued to tell her story, adding obviously inappropriate elements to it again and again. More and more contradictions arose. With each new encounter with the police, they became more convincing. The woman did not seem convincing. She not only completed the story, but even admitted that she had met with one of her lovers, named Michael Garza, just a few hours before Robert's death. Without much hesitation, she reported that she met with the lover in his apartment, that the couple had sex, and that a surveillance camera recorded the other lover, Brad Golden. Characteristic of the investigators' conversations with Kacie were the long pauses she made before answering the police officer's questions. The communication looked more and more like an attempt to deceive the investigators. She stated that she knew about Robert's meeting with the lawyer because he had finally decided to file for divorce after catching her with her lover. Kacie did not want to end the relationship, as she agreed with everything. Apparently, she also hinted that she regularly cheated. That sounded, of course, absurd. In her conversation, she came back to Michael Garza and described him as the man she wanted to talk to. Their affair began in the summer of 2016 after they met on social networks. Surprisingly, the man was pictured in one of his profile pictures with Kacie in an intimate moment. When the woman was addressed about this, she said she felt guilty but sounded insincere. All this could not please Robert, of course. He was inconsolable and frustrated and shared his worries with his friends at the fire station. His colleagues advised him to separate from his young wife, as it was obvious that Robert did not suit her. The large age difference, 18 years, and her lustful inclinations played a role, and the man tormented himself. Robert insisted that he had put everything into this marriage and, even after the obvious cases of infidelity, hoped to keep it alive. To achieve this, Robert decided to go on vacation to Mexico with the family. However, on Wednesday, they returned from Mexico, and Robert admitted that he couldn't take it anymore and would file for divorce. Already on Friday, he was shot. After the police learned more details about Michael Garza, they had even more questions for the suspect. Kacie insisted that she loved Robert despite her affairs and wanted to save their marriage, which is why she had arranged to meet her husband in the restaurant on that fateful night. She had tried to save their marriage. The widow repeated her story about the stranger, now adding details about his height. She couldn't recognize his skin color, but said the man was at least 1.80 meters tall. One fact puzzled the investigators. The man who had committed the random murder left the only witness who had seen him alive. But why? For the police officers, there was only one answer to this question. Kacie was kept alive because she was acquainted with the perpetrator. The main suspect was put under pressure, and after 2 hours of interrogation, she changed her statement and admitted that she knew the murderer. It was her lover, Michael Garza, who was sitting in the passenger seat of her car at the time of the shooting. This suggested that the widow could have lured Robert into a trap. Kacie's story changed. According to her, she told Michael shortly before the tragedy about Robert's outbursts of anger and turned against her husband with powerful insults that she had endured for years. Kacie admitted that Michael had gotten into her car that night and offered to scare her husband. The plan was to beat him up and convince him not to mistreat his wife anymore. To achieve this, they decided to fake a situation where the car got stuck in a rut. The main suspect insisted that she had not seen the shotgun that the lover had brought to this meeting, as it was not part of their plans. Michael sat at the wheel and suddenly turned off the highway onto a tractor path. He said he would wait for Robert here and asked his lover to call her husband. Kacie now claimed that it was the lover who had decided to attack him. When her husband arrived, she noticed a touching detail. Robert, in her opinion, smelled of the same perfume he had used on their wedding day. She realized that he had perfumed himself with this scent to please his wife. Kacie joked about it, and Robert laughed. Despite the relaxed atmosphere, the husband had only a few minutes to live. Kacie admitted to the investigators that she had called stop immediately after her husband got into the car. According to her, she wanted to stop her lover that way. She emphasized that she didn't know about the weapons in the car, but simply realized that everything was wrong and decided to prevent a possible fight. But shortly after she said that, a shot rang out. Michael did not react to her words, but when Kacie called for help, he grabbed the phone and threw it on the ground before fleeing. After the investigators had heard all these fabrications and lies, they were finally convinced that Kacie was involved in the murder. The law enforcement authorities believed that she played an important role in this plan, voluntarily and fully aware of what would happen. Already the next day after the murder, on September 10th, the widow was arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder. The couple's daughter was left with the mother of the alleged perpetrator. At the same time, the investigators began searching for the lover, Michael Garza. On September 15, 2016, Robert Pointer was buried. He was solemnly accompanied on his last journey by firefighters from all over Texas. Many tears were shed at the funeral ceremony. This man had really saved lives and seemed simply invincible in the fight against fire, but became a victim of his feelings and betrayal. The man's family said that in the last days of his life, he was really ready to separate definitively from his young wife. He seemed very tired of the relationship and the way she kept behaving toward him. About a week before his death, Robert was in contact with a divorce lawyer and sent him a worrying message on social media the day before the tragedy. The man wrote that he feared a surprise attack. During this time, he was working on putting the family home up for sale and also wanted full custody of his daughter from his second marriage. The next day, he died, and the investigators were sure that it was not a simple coincidence or a conflict with a lover that had gotten out of control. The investigators believed it was a carefully planned murder. The eldest daughter of the deceased was sure that Kacie had a strong motive for the murder. As the family relationships began to deteriorate, the wife convinced Robert to make her the main beneficiary of the life insurance policy instead of his daughters. It was a large sum of $685,000. When the police received this information, all the controversies and confusing aspects of the case came together. The young woman realized that there was no turning back and simply decided to make the best of the separation from her husband. The fact that she left 3 children fatherless was indifferent to her. In April 2016, 5 months before the tragedy, Robert changed his life insurance policy. When the investigators subsequently checked the suspect's mobile phone and computer, they found numerous pieces of evidence that she was looking for a hitman to murder her husband. More than 10,000 messages were sent to Kacie's lover. The prosecution identified at least 4 men with whom the perpetrator had an extramarital affair at that time. When Kacie realized that Michael was the most impressionable of them, she began to put her cunning plan into action. The idea was to convince him of the danger Robert posed to her. The widow played the victim, told lies about domestic violence, and used sex as her most convincing argument. In fact, she told all 4 lovers a similar story, but only Michael fell for the lie. Just as she was on vacation in Mexico, the firefighter's wife texted him that she feared for her life. Kacie told him to go to the police if she didn't return from her trip and tell them that she had been harassed by her own husband. This was the last and most effective trick, after which the lover was ready to kill. In response to this message, he said he would shoot Robert. In the interrogation, the widow excused herself by saying that she thought it was an unfortunate joke. The investigators also spoke with the other lovers of the widow. Brad Golden had no idea that she was even married and believed that Kacie had been divorced since 2014. But she also told him terrible stories about Robert and claimed that her supposed ex-husband was stalking her. But Brad didn't want to get involved in these lies and provocations and recommended that she go to the police. Although the widow used the abuse story as the main excuse, the investigators could never confirm such behavior of the murdered man. Neither neighbors nor were witnesses of family problems or incidents of comparable magnitude as described by the accused. No one had ever seen bruises on the woman's body. Even at the time of her husband's death, she was examined and no traces of blows were found. People continued to emphasize that Robert was one of the kindest people they had ever known. When the investigators wanted to further clarify the circumstances of the events, they received more and more lies from Kacie. Michael was on the run. The police searched his house, but the man was never found. Apparently, he realized that there was no chance of escaping justice, and so he turned himself in to the authorities the next day. He was charged with the murder of Robert Pointer. The arrested man did not cooperate in any way, refused to communicate with the police, and instead immediately demanded a lawyer. The investigators still didn't have the murder weapon and were actively searching for it, but without success. Fortunately, the problem was solved when a farmer reported to the police a few weeks after the murder. While plowing a field, he discovered a shotgun a few hundred meters away from the place where the firefighter had been shot. The rifle was still loaded, and the found bullets were compared with the bullet that killed Robert. They matched 100%. Next to the shotgun, a shirt was found whose DNA matched Michael's. After that, the police officers went back to Kacie. She finally admitted that she knew about the existence of the shotgun, but was still stubborn and didn't know that she was involved in planning the crime. On July 10, 2018, the trial began against the alleged perpetrator of the massacre, Michael Garza. At this hearing, he continued to protest his innocence and made a shocking statement. He said he had borrowed the shotgun from his brother, but not to kill Robert himself, but to give it to Kacie at her request. As an alibi, he stated that at the time of the massacre, he was on his farm, which is several dozen kilometers away from the crime scene, taking care of a sick cow. However, he could not provide any solid evidence for his alibi. Despite all attempts at justification, the jurors did not believe the man, and on July 20th, he was found guilty and sentenced to 99 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. After that, the Pointer family focused on ensuring that Kacie got what she deserved. The prosecution insisted that Robert's widow was the mastermind behind the massacre because she absolutely wanted the money. The obvious argument was that Michael himself could hardly have lured Robert alone onto the country road in the middle of nowhere. He was clearly supported by the victim's wife, who played her role perfectly. The prosecution used the defendant's correspondence to substantiate all these arguments. The indictment also showed Kacie's true face. She used Michael only as a pawn and pretended that she really loved him. The man, in turn, turned out to be superficial, because after the murder and communication with the police, the double-tongued widow wanted to spend the night with her other lover, Brad Golden. Her correspondences also showed this, obviously. The widow's lawyer insisted that the prosecutors demonized Kacie's image and that all eyes were focused on her extramarital affairs. But that did not make his client a murderer, not even a conspirator. The only thing that could be blamed on the accused was negligence and carelessness in her sexual relationships because she had overlooked the violence of Michael Garza. But all this, according to the defense attorney, had simply gotten out of control without her being to blame for it. The defense attorney argued that if there had been a treacherous plan, the true villainess would not have called the emergency center after the shooting, but would have tried to cover her tracks. This was a valid argument. The prosecution insisted that such behavior was caused by the panic attack that was triggered in Kacie. In any case, it was not easy to justify the accused's image. Although Kacie did not testify in the trial, the jurors heard her speech on videos recorded by the police, which captured a revealing moment. Kacie held her hands to her head and said, "Oh no, what have I done?" It was a kind of confession of her involvement in her husband's murder. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jurors found Kacie Pointer guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, which will be suspended after 30 years for parole. Her last words were, "He didn't have to die." The insurance payments for Robert's life were divided equally among his 3 daughters. Custody of the youngest girl is shared by the parents of the biological mother. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.